Welcome to the Great White Brotherhood YouTube channel.
Hello, everybody. We're on the final chapter now of the book, The Path of Mankind. So, chapter 11, The Way Through the Light. I'm going to break this actually into two sections. It's only 12 pages, but I want to make sure I have a little bit of time at the end of the chapter to just kind of summarize what we've read. Okay, so let's jump in here. Chapter 11, The Way Through the Light. In previous chapters, we mentioned the path that the spirit takes once it is freed from the physical body. In this chapter, we will describe the path that is taken through the heavenly spheres as one settles into the spiritual life in the heavenly dimensions. We have intimated that what is termed heaven is a series of illusions, but as one progresses through these areas, they appear real, just as an earthly incarnation appears real. We already gave an overview of Summerland and a brief glimpse into heaven and hell. However, these areas that we looked at presumed that the people who stay in Summerland or hell are those who are not far removed spiritually from those that have recently finished an incarnation on earth and, thus, have only a limited spiritual development. We tend to investigate the higher spheres of the spiritual planes, talk about what they look like as far as it is possible to describe them, and talk about the beings that live there. So, when someone is ready to advance beyond the beautiful and peaceful Summerland, he starts to feel the desire to progress. It must be said that a normally good person can reside in Summerland as long as he desires, and some remain permanently in that area, as it satisfies the yearnings of their soul. But many, eventually, start to feel the desire to progress. So, unconsciously, they reach out with their thoughts, and their thoughts are picked up by angelic beings charged with helping and monitoring the progress of people in all the various planes of both heaven and hell. This, when they understand the desire of someone to progress, causes great delight to these angelic beings, as they know another soul is on the path to perfection. So, these angels meet together and study the past life of the individual, his life in heaven before incarnation, during his incarnation, and what has interested him since returning to Summerland. It must be noted that, upon the return of someone to Summerland, the individual is largely left to his own devices, allowing him to acclimatize, then either doing nothing but enjoying the peace and beauty of that place. Others are naturally drawn to investigate the mysteries of life, as we have tried to present to you in our various talks, and the questions that we have answered. But no one is pushed to study, and any more than we push you to accept knowledge we present to you. So, some people accept knowledge and some reject it. Others are just not interested in progressing, and so are left to live as they choose. But once someone feels the yearning to advance, experienced angelic beings examine the past history of that person, examine and quantify the knowledge that he has already accumulated, and, above all, try to understand that person's interests. It is extremely important to correctly identify a person's deep interests from the moment he leaves Summerland. He will follow a path that will take him along the long road to total knowledge of that subject. Thus, eventually, the person is approached and asked if he would be in agreement to follow a certain path for many long years. We break off here to make a comparison between what occurs in heaven and that which occurs on earth. A child is taught basic skills, but at some point, decisions as to the future are made. Some drop out of school and just drift. Others continue with their studies until they feel the desire to specialize. These specialties can cover a wide gamut of subjects, but if the student follows a path, he might well continue for all his career in that field. So, you can see the similarity between behaviors in heaven and on earth. As above, so below. Therefore, you can also see the importance of choosing the correct road for the person because it would be futile to push someone into a discipline that does not interest him. These disciplines, these paths, can cover any subject imaginable. It is often thought that the only subject taught in heaven is spirituality. This is not so. It is far from the truth. Every conceivable subject is available for study, and students are encouraged to experiment and develop new technologies and new ways of quantifying matter. This knowledge eventually being made available to man incarnate. Therefore, a subject of interest to the person seeking advancement is decided upon, and the person leaves Summerland. Should anyone think that they also abandon their loved ones, let us quickly disabuse you of that idea. Through the development of telepathy and clairvoyance, natural abilities in heaven, people who care for each other are always in contact. Our old friend, the law of mutual attraction, assures that. So, as we just said, the person leaves Summerland. This is where it gets complicated to describe where the individual is taken. Some, interested in the study of plants, for instance, would be taken to an area where a vast range of plants are growing. There would also be laboratories where one can study the microbiological aspects of plants. Further, there are areas where the DNA of plants is available for deep study. So, the individual concerned would find everything that he would need to investigate and comprehend all that there is to know about plants. Equally, there would be a number of students like himself learning. These students would be of different levels of knowledge. Some would be learning the different basic knowledge of biology, and some would already be specializing in a particular aspect, or, indeed, quantifying all that can be comprehended concerning one plant or one aspect of the life of a plant or plants. You can see from these few lines that whatever aspect of biology of plants is known, that information is passed on to the student according to his interests. The subject of doing all this is not only for the benefit of the student, but eventually that knowledge is passed through the astral realms to people awaiting incarnation who have a natural interest in biology, but it also is passed to people incarnate. This might be done through dreams or moments of inspiration. Thus, all of mankind, incarnate and discarnate, benefits from the studies of these students. This concept, excuse me, this concept is available to all people in heaven that desire to progress whatever their interest. No aspect of knowledge is ignored. Whatever someone desires to study, there is an area, a school, one might say, available for the student to study. However, there are no examinations, no diplomas. Each student continues his studies until he is satisfied that he has learned enough. As time does not exist in heaven, a student may study for as long or short a time as he desires. Some stay for vast amounts of time studying a certain subject. Of course, should the student realize that a mistake was made and he is not really interested in the designated subject, he may cease and choose another route. So, we wish all students of cosmic consciousness to understand clearly that life in heaven is not, in most cases, just a time spent in idleness. Heaven is a hive of activity carried out in a very organized fashion, so that all those who wish to be active can be and can follow whatever path interests them to whatever degree of perfection they seek. For those who still feel the need for housing, it is provided, and in almost all cases, there are planes of beauty, very much like Summerland, and depending on the degree of spiritual advancement of the individual as he progresses through the spheres, light becomes brighter and everything shines more. The exception, of course, would be for those brave souls who decide to experience the doleful areas referred to as hell, because there are a number of people who undertake to devote their future to trying to help the wretches suffering in hell through their past misdeeds committed when incarnate. We have great admiration for those people that we could refer to as nurses, doctors, psychologists, and social workers who devote vast amounts of time delving into the doleful plains of hell instead of choosing a different path, enabling them to stay in the light and beauty. So, these helpers go down into the Stygian depths of hell, where the most terrible criminals, if we may refer to them in that earthly term, reside. The people who reside in those depths of darkness and despair do so because when they were incarnate, they committed the most heinous crimes against man and animals. They did these crimes for the pleasure of administering suffering. The sheer pleasure of inflicting excruciating pain on any creature capable of undergoing that torture. When these people had suffered their life review, they showed no signs of remorse, and so, by the law of mutual attraction, were drawn to levels where they, too, could experience the suffering, not physical, but mental suffering. So, these social workers descend from time to time down to the depths in which these terrible people reside and try to persuade them to repent their crimes so they could start the long climb back towards the light. Generally speaking, that help is refused. The people are so far removed from any human decency that they are incapable of accepting help and advice, and although most of them are deeply unhappy, they prefer to remain where they are rather than change. This may seem odd to ordinary people that anyone would wish to live in the depths of hell rather than accept help to escape, but there are such people. Many of us have met people with similar attitude. We break off here in our description of the residents of the darkest areas to question an alternative version of hell believed to exist by many. This is the fiery pit. People describe in NDEs, near death experiences, going down into a pit full of fire with imps torturing the victims and so on. This dreadful place is described in the Bible in some detail, and yet does not at all correspond with the hell that we described dark, dank, and dismal. So, what is going on here that has created two places, one the opposite of the other? Let us try to explain. We have stated in other talks that thoughts are things, and if enough people believe something to be true, it creates in the etheric realms a thought form that appears real. So, the archons, many thousands of years ago, decided to introduce the concept of a fiery pit. The reason was that religions were first introduced in what we now call the Middle East. These are hot countries, and before any form of modern air conditioning was introduced, a modern invention, people suffered from the heat. Therefore, it seemed logical to the archons to introduce into their invented religions the concept of a fiery pit as a punishment as suffering from the heat was all too well known. Over the years, people started to believe in this place, and so, in the low etheric realm, this place was created as a thought form. Thus, when some Christian or Muslim people have a near death experience and know that they have been less than good people, they find themselves in this fiery pit. It is not real, it is imagined brought into a type of reality. To return to what we were discussing, the depths of hell. It might be questioned why hell exists at all and why it exists in ever more cold, dark, and dismal realms. The answer, as always, is simple. people have consciousness. There are endless aspects of consciousness. Imagine, for example, what it would be like if we could link with a being like the Master Jesus, and if we could savor what his consciousness would be like. Would it feel dismal and dark, mean, selfish, full of hate, or would it feel the opposite to all that? Would we feel joy, bliss, lovingness to all things? We don't even need to answer that question because we all know the answer. So, being full of God's love for all, Jesus went when his incarnation on earth was finished, created in his new world in heaven a space that corresponded to all those noble sentiments. We create our own reality in heaven, much as we do whilst incarnate. But incarnation in this dense reality makes manipulation of reality more difficult. In the heavenly spheres, manifestation is instantaneous, and so, when Jesus arrived in heaven, his beautiful world in which he lives was already awaiting him. It is the same for all of us. We create the reality we are drawn to according to our level of consciousness. Thus, with regard to the various levels of hell, the consciousness of numerous people is less than holy. It ranges from just being selfish and not caring about other people at the highest end to the most cruel, psychopathic people imaginable at the low end. And so, just as Jesus created a paradise due to his extremely elevated consciousness, the lesser people create a place in hell for themselves due to their negative attitudes. These areas are dark, dank, and dismal areas. These areas are dark, dank, and dismal areas because if we could link with their consciousness, those would be the impressions that we would receive. The coldness and the darkness caused by shutting out the light of God. So, for every aspect of consciousness, both positive and negative, there is a level of heaven and hell. Now, we now mention something that could not exist on earth, and it is this. We mentioned that if we choose, we can go to places where we can learn, and that in those places there is a variety of students and teachers. Each one of these people would be at a particular level of consciousness, and yet they would all be mixing together. The strange thing is that each one of these people would have associated with him his world created by his consciousness. So many people can mix and work together, and yet each one has his individual reality, spirituality associated with him. We mentioned that this could not exist on earth, and in the obvious fashion that it manifests itself in heaven, it is so. But in fact, excuse me, but in fact, even on earth, people mix who are at various levels of spirituality, but it is not as obvious as it is in heaven. In heaven, it manifests itself also by the degree of light emitting from the astral body of the person. We once more, we return once more into hell and follow the noble spirits that undertake that work. Those people would shine with the light of God emanating from their bodies, and we could easily see that this would create a problem. The individuals living for long years in the relative or total darkness would not welcome into their midst someone aglow with spiritual light, and so those that administer to the lost souls learn to lower their spiritual frequency so that they shine less brightly. Thus, they are able to minister to those suffering in the darkness of hell without frightening them. This ability to lessen one's level of spirituality is an extremely difficult thing to learn to do, as it flies in the face of their natural level of consciousness. In fact, it causes these helpers extreme discomfort because they actually have to learn to be cold hearted entities like the people to whom they administer, and we must admire such people who deliberately choose to become heartless wretches in order to be at one with the people they help. Of course, when they leave hell, they can shake off their low feelings and return to the noble beings that they really are. To complete this short overview of hell and why people are drawn there, we should say that it happens from time to time that a person is not only not able to progress towards the light, but he becomes more and more unlike anything that one could call an aspect of God, and that his God spirit becomes extinct. The, the light of God is snuffed out, and the individual ceases to exist. Fortunately, this is rare, but is something that we have to mention. The next part that we have to mention is how one progresses up through the spheres, the dimensions within the dimensions, on the long progression towards perfection. This is surprisingly simple in principle, but like so much to do with spirituality, is the opposite to what one might imagine to be the case. Logic would suggest that it would be a case of learning endless subjects, each one more difficult than the previous, whereas, in fact, it is the relatively simple task of letting go of ego. Ego, as we have has often ego, as we have often said, is both part of the fight, flight, protective aspect, which, of course, we take into heaven with us, but is no longer needed in those peaceful, loving spheres, as there is nothing to fight or to fear in the light-filled domains. But ego is also that aspect of personality that gives us individuality, makes us feel separate one from the other, another. At the risk of repeating that which we have already explained, the sense of individuality is actually our God aspect, pushing us to be the unique recipient of God. It is given to us by God and is vitally necessary part of us, particularly when in incarnation. We have mentioned that we see it clearly in the vegetable and floral community, where a plant or tree, for instance, does all that it can to be the dominant life force where it grows, seeking to get all the nutrients, moisture, and sunlight that it requires to allow it to grow and be the best possible example of God in incarnation, at the expense of any and all other plants in its immediate area. I'm going to break off right here so I can make part two and be able to summarize the book at the end of the chapter. So I will see you very shortly here on part two. Thank you. Okay, we continue on with part two of chapter 11, which is again the final chapter of this book. So we start from where we left off. This is understandable, of course. Otherwise, the God force could not be the ultimate power that it is. God gains experience through growth. God would not gain much experience from plants that remained weak and spindly, although it must be said that God is interested in all aspects of life, even failures. But if a species died out, obviously, there would be nothing for God to learn from. Sorry. So, God pushes plants to grow to perfection, even at the expense of robbing other plants of the energy they require. Thus, there is a constant battle waging between plants to try to succeed at all costs. This concept of trying to win the battle for life is part of the ego. Now, we mention this because we retain this aspect of ego when we return to the heavenly spheres, and it is very necessary to retain it as it gives us the drive to learn, to progress through the spheres in our drive to reach perfection. Just as each plant on earth strives to become the best possible example of its species, so we humans strive to be the best possible example of humanity in whatever field of activity we choose to pursue. Once again, we stress that God can learn from failure, but learns more from success. So, man arrives in heaven with at least two aspects of ego in place: fight/flight, and the desire to succeed at the expense of all other humans. It is obvious that the fight slash flight aspect is quickly eliminated because it is not required outside of physicality, and thus that aspect of ego dies from lack of nourishment. But the drive to succeed remains, and, we repeat, is placed within us by God itself to enable us to succeed in whatever domain we choose to explore, both during our incarnation and on into the endless, non physical spheres. This ego driven desire to succeed at the expense of others flies in the face of statements that we have made earlier that we are all one. We cannot be the unique holder of the God Spirit, excluding all others, and be at one with all life at the same time, or can we? It is possible to be the unique holder of the God force and yet be part of and the total of all that exists at once. We need to resolve this dilemma, this dichotomy of apparently being two opposing forces at the same time. This is what we were referring to in this section of this chapter, exploring how we progress towards perfection by letting go of ego. It occurs to us as we mull this problem over in our mind that we need to start by resolving one part first, and then, hopefully, the second part will resolve itself. Most of us find it easier to grasp the concept that we are all one. As we fill our lives with peace and as we develop love for all things, we develop this ability to feel love and togetherness for all life. So, we breathe a sigh of relief. That is the first part resolved. Then we turn our attention to the second part, getting rid of the feeling that we are the unique representation that matters of the God force. And that probably should say matters to the God force, but I think you understand what I'm saying. If not, ask a question. Suddenly, God, our higher self, kicks in and protests. God itself, which is manifest in our higher self, refuses to take a back seat because it reasons that God is all that exists and God has chosen me to be its unique, important person, as regards humanity at least. So, we sit down and try to resolve this problem. We can concede that all humanity, indeed all life, has the right to live, but we are not willing to let that kindness to others extend to the point that they are all that matters and I do not count at all. In other words, I demand the right to exist because God told me, via my higher self, that I was specially chosen by God to present it. Now, this is the great blockage to progress that we mentioned earlier, and that all must resolve if they wish to progress towards the higher spheres. It is not only rejecting ego, but entails possibly rejecting God itself. But can we do this? Rejecting ego is difficult enough for many people, and it must be said that a lot of people stumble at this hurdle and turn back, remaining permanently in the lower spheres of light, unable to reject ego completely. But for those that do manage to pass this barrier, a yet much higher, more difficult barrier remains to be confronted. What do we do about being the sole aspect of God in existence? At this point, once again, many turn back because to go on will take the person into uncharted waters. Excuse me. This is understandable. Not everyone has sufficient blind faith to take the next step. This step is to cut our connection with God, our higher self. We might think that we only have had our higher self for a relatively short period of time, but in fact, we have had the God Spirit attached to us, constantly guiding and advising us for an enormous period of time, and it is unthinkable for many to break that connection, thus Progress halts at that point. For those courageous enough to continue, they make the decision to reject their higher self, not knowing where they might go and what might happen. We can describe the process of excluding God from our lives, and we can describe the destiny of those who take the plunge and see the processes through to the end, but nothing can describe the feeling of helplessness that this journey provokes. It has to be experienced in order to understand. Surprisingly, this voyage into nothingness is quite well known. It is mentioned in the Bible in connection with Jesus, where it suggests that the Master, before ascending into paradise, went to hell. It has been mentioned by people who have had a difficult problem to resolve and think that they have wandered through the wilderness, but of course, it was not so. Let us describe as best we can how this process unfolds. Once the decision has been taken to reject the God aspect, a specially trained guide appears. Indeed, there may be more than one guide, but this voyage into the unknown is not something that a person enters into lightly, and so much explanation, much study is required to prepare the student for the experience. If someone attempted to start the journey without sufficient preparation, it would end in failure. Already, no one is permitted to attempt this journey unless they have been in the spirit world for sufficient length of time as to be in the possession of much spiritual education. Equally, the person has to have sufficient strength of character to be permitted to face this ultimate test, and has to have risen to sufficient heights to have the courage and faith to confront this challenge. But if it is decided that this person has sufficient attributes to face this test, he undergoes long and detailed training. This test, if the person passes, is the ultimate one that will open the door to someone becoming an angel. So you can see the importance of preparation in all aspects for passing. Once the person passes this test, which we repeat is challenging beyond anything that we can imagine, a sudden change occurs. It is like a death and a rebirth into a dimension that is excluded from all who have not passed this test. This individual loses all sense of his individuality and becomes filled with the feeling of oneness for all life. In effect, he becomes filled with God power and becomes what is termed an archangel. His life is not finished at this point by any means, but his progress through the spheres in effect ceases, and there are no more steps for him to take. He becomes, in effect, a universe-wide consciousness, and he is able to send love to all people in all dimensions. He becomes supremely happy, filled with God's power. So, in effect, the story of man's progression from creation to ultimate God manifestation is complete. Well, that's the end of the book. I do hope sincerely that you have enjoyed these chapters. I thank all of you who take your time to sit through and listen or watch me read these chapters to you and for you. For those who have started from the beginning and have gotten to chapter 11, I thank you very much for hanging in there through all this, and I appreciate it very much. Um, if you have any questions, certainly, specifically to the book, but if you have any questions at all, do please, leave a question or a comment in the underneath the video in the comments section, and I am more than happy to answer them. And just to kind of summarize the book in itself, I think this book came out in 2017. It's now 2023 as I read this book to you. And I think the timing of this book is actually quite important because if we remember back quite a few chapters, the Great White Brotherhood had stated that we're moving into the time of light we're moving into more positive times. It is coming. However, I think that, as the chapters had stated, that it may become or seem to become darker before it becomes brighter. I can't remember exactly what the words were, but basically, uh, those who are in positions of power, who have been long in the positions of power under the darkness or under the influence, shall we say, and I'm not talking about presidents, and I'm not talking about anybody who's been in power for a short period of time. I'm talking about families and other um, things that have been in power for long periods of time. They will not want to give up their power. They will not want to give up their positions of, um, you know, their positions that they hold right now, that they feel is theirs. So that's why I feel that this book actually, sorry, is it's a good moment for this book to be read, for you to read and understand, because even though there's a lot of talk about how great life will be, and it truly will be, I think, I know, based on this book and also what is happening, that we are very possibly going to be going through some tough times before the good times arrive. Because again, as the Great White Brotherhood have stated, those who are in power, who feel they have the right to control and have ownership over us and the earth, they do not want to let go of their power. And those who influence them also don't want to lose control. So, not to be, I don't want to be doomy and gloomy anymore. I do hope that you have enjoyed this book. It's one of my favorites, other than the first book, Stairway to Freedom. I enjoy them all. There's 9 total books, this being the second. And I do encourage you to read them all if you can. But this is definitely one of my personal favorite books. I learned a lot from this book, and I hope you did too. So this is the end of this book, and I am going to be moving on to a new project, which I will reveal in a different video. I don't want to tie up any more of this time on this video, and I'll be coming back to you in a new video shortly to let you know what this new project will be that I will be starting in the new year. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please visit our website at thegreatwhitebrotherhood.org for free books and lessons to help you on your spiritual journey.